Is everything working all right? Good. Welcome everybody to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for the Division of Extension Wisconsin 4-H. And on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, PBS Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Teri Allendorf. She's with Community Conservation, which is an organization in Viroqua. She's going to speak with us about community conservation from Wisconsin to the world. Teri, I forgot to tell you about this, but I'm going to ask you the 5 questions that I ask everybody. If you want to stand here, that would be great. The rules are you can answer the questions any way that you want. The answers don't have to be true, they just have to be believable. Teri, where were you born?
Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. Bellefonte.
Bellefonte, beautiful fountain.
Yeah.
Wow.
No hospital at Penn State, so I was born in Bellefonte.
Did your parents work at Penn State?
We're going to school. Young parents going to undergrad. Yeah.
What were they studying?
Dad was studying biology, and mom education, I think.
Way to go.
Library sciences, yeah.
All right. And then where'd you go to high school?
Hellgate High School in Missoula, Montana. That's too good to lie about, right?
Why, you can't swear like that on Zoom. And then where'd you go undergrad and what did you study?
I went to Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, and studied physical anthropology, studied primates. Thought I would be Jane Goodall.
How'd that work out?
I'm not Jane Goodall, but I'm closer than I thought I would be after I switched from the Medill School of Journalism to that.
Way to go.
Didn't know what I wanted to do, but I kind of made my way back to it.
Nice. And then where'd you go for your advanced degrees?
University of Minnesota, PhD in conservation biology.
Very good. And then you were in the Peace Corps.
Yes, I was in Nepal. Yeah, which I'm going to talk about also in my talk.
Excellent. How long have you been with community conservation?
I started on the board over 10 years ago and then became the executive director about 3 years ago.
Nice. And you live in Mazo?
I live in Mazo, Maine, yep, with my husband and son who are over there.
Did you pay them to cheer?
No, they're just really good that way.
This is great. I'm looking forward to your talk. Would you please join me in welcoming Teri Allendorf to Wednesday Night at the Lab.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Tom. I had no idea what a family atmosphere this had just from watching, on PBS. So it's really nice to see all of you, and thanks for coming tonight. So I'm going to be talking about community conservation from Wisconsin to the world. And I wanted to start out, the first few times, probably I got this email once or twice and I didn't see Tom's, I didn't realize how much text he put after the schedule. And he had this beautiful piece about driving out on Highway 14 right past Mazo where I live. And he talked about, the birds he was seeing and he just had this great quote that I just wanted to make sure everyone saw. So go back to your email if you didn't read his whole piece. It was really nice. And then talking about reverberating with sagas from communities closer to home. I hope that's the message that you come away with in the end. So this is Community Conservation's founder. I'm going to start with a little bit of history about community conservation. Then I'm going to talk a little bit more academically about community conservation, what it is, and why it works. And then I'm going to go back to the story of community conservation and the current projects that we have around the world and use them as examples of community conservation. So this is Dr. Rob Horwich, who in the 80s, he was a primatologist, was interested in saving primates, and realized in the 80s working with communities, I think like many conservation biologists did actually, that communities were really important to conserving the biodiversity that you're studying, right? So he was converted in the 1980s working in Belize. And he lived in Gays Mills, so our office for many years, he moved there in the 1970s to Gays Mills. The office started community conservation in 1989, worked out of his office. Now we're in Viroqua. He died in 2017, but he worked as hard in Wisconsin at community conservation as he did around the world. And this is just a list of some of the organizations he either helped to found or he was supportive of. He's someone who went to all the meetings and supported all these types of things in the area. He also, many people don't know, I think, was the one who came up with the idea of costumes to hand raise cranes at International Crane Foundation. That was his original idea. But I want to point out that community conservation in Wisconsin has a long history. I mean, it has a long history if we go way back, right? Communities have been conserving and managing biodiversity for a long time. But in terms of projects that are published about and we recognize, the Coon Valley had the soil conservation project that is very famous, just had its 90th anniversary. And as Kurt Miney has said, who many of you have probably heard his name, a Wisconsin-based conservation biologist and Aldo Leopold's biographer, the solution today is the same as it was 90 years ago, locally led conservation. So what I'm talking about isn't new, it's just not quite as common as we want it to be, right? It's not as much of a go-to solution to the biodiversity crisis as we would like it to be. So community conservation over the years has had more than 27 projects in 15 countries, and here's a map of all those projects. And a lot of it was Rob, one by one, going and working with NGOs, local organizations, and communities in those areas. So now I'm going to talk about what is community conservation. Community conservation is communities conserving biodiversity, right? It's the communities actually doing it. So it's them having some form of land tenure over habitat or a geographical area, often through something like community forestry. Most countries have some kind of policy that allows communities to manage and conserve and protect land. So community forestry or a form of concession. So it's them having some form of tenure and then them making the rules and participating in making the rules, like everyone in the community, in how they're going to enforce and protect that area. And then the community actually doing the monitoring and enforcement. And in most of our project sites, that's sort of the model that you're going for. Policies don't always allow that, and you'll see some examples. But that's what you want, is the community actually prioritizing, making the decisions, and doing the conservation in partnership. It always requires government or NGOs. They're not isolated. They can't do it alone. They need help and support in different ways, but that's the basic crux of it. And then from that come benefits for the community. So the benefits of community conservation are that people have more sustainable livelihoods. And they also have healthier communities because they're living in healthier environments, right? So a lot of times when you hear every organization, WWF, Conservation International, they'll say they're doing community conservation. And in some areas they're doing what I'm talking about at the top, but a lot of times they're talking more about livelihoods or trying to provide benefits for people. Not always, not actually building their capacity to do the conservation themselves and make the decisions over it. So that's just one reason I wanted to go into that. It was just sort of to clarify what communities really doing conservation means. And it works, this is successful around the world because communities are good conservationists. There's a lot of research that shows that community managed areas are as effective or even more effective than traditional protected areas like national parks and reserves. So if we combine traditional protected areas, because I'm not against those, with community conserved areas, we have the potential to just greatly expand the area that is being managed sustainably across the entire globe. We could easily get to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity's target of 30% of the globe protected. In fact, we're even close to that if you count certain types of protected areas by local communities, or even the Global Deal for Nature, which some of you might have heard of, which is trying to say we need to protect half of the globe. And just to talk a little bit of numbers, even if we just looked at indigenous people who comprise about 6% of the world's population, there are estimates that they already informally, sometimes formally, manage 30% of the earth, right? And they're doing it more sustainably than most governments are. And if you added local communities onto that, which means a lot of rural communities, we get up to like 50% of people in the world that would be directly participating in managing biodiversity. So it's something that could take over the whole globe if we supported the right policies. Here's a map just of they've mapped the land just controlled informally or formally by indigenous peoples. So you can see that it's a large part of the globe. So to talk a little bit about my background before I go into some of the research that I've done that explains why community conservation works so well, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal, as Tom mentioned. I did my PhD in conservation biology, and I just want to mention that I've done a lot of consulting for USAID, which has been very helpful for me because I like to work down at the local level with communities, but I do evaluations and other project scoping for USAID, which is the U.S. Agency for International Development. So in Nepal, for example, there might be a $35 million biodiversity project over 5 years, and I've been asked to come in and evaluate that. So to have that top-down perspective on what the big NGOs are doing, like WWF at 35 million, and then what you can do from the ground up with communities at maybe 20,000 a year, it's been really valuable. And currently, as we talked about, I'm the Executive Director of Community Conservation. And I wanted to bring up Nepal just because I was in Peace Corps there in the early 1990s when community forestry became an official policy in the country and really started to take off. So Nepal is this amazing example of what at a national level, policies that support communities to protect their environment, what can happen. So in the 1970s, scientists were predicting that all the forest in Nepal, all the forest would be lost by 2000, given the trajectory it was on. And that rhinos and tigers, just two charismatic species, would disappear by the 1980s. And now, through the policies, community forestry and then protected area buffer zone policies that also supported local communities to participate in protected area management, the forest cover has doubled. It's gone from a low of 26% to 45%, nearly half the country. 30% of all households in Nepal participate in community forest user groups, are actively participating in helping to manage forests. That protects 30% of the forests, with another third in protected areas, because Nepal has an amazing protected area system, and then another 30% is government forest, which probably should get turned over to local communities, right? They're still making new community forests, so it probably will be. They've had zero poaching of rhinos for a few years in their protected areas, and it is one of the few countries that we reached the WWF goal of doubling their tiger population. Right, so unbelievably successful. And I just want to point out that this is in the context, if any of you are interested in population issues, in one of the most densely populated countries in the world, right? I love these figures. So here you have, this is Asia, and all those spikes, that's population density, right? So you've got Asia is just incredibly densely populated compared to the rest of the world. And here, this area up here, that's the Himalaya area, that's where Nepal is. Even more densely populated. So in an area where there's this much population, they are effectively managing biodiversity, right? So the correlation between population and the environment is not so clear. And in Nepal, you could probably argue a lot of it's because you have a lot of people on the ground actively managing their environment and caring about it and depending on it and appreciating it, right? So in a place like Africa where there's very few people, it's pretty easy for poachers to get in and do things because there's not local communities helping to protect those areas. But I want to point out that Nepal is amazing, and it's an amazing example of community conservation at a national level. But if you ever talk to someone who's also a conservationist in Nepal, they're probably going to give you a much more pessimistic perspective than me, because the trends in Nepal over 50 years are amazing, right? But you look at any particular moment in time, and people will say, yeah, but we're still not distributing the benefits equally. There still aren't enough people involved in community forestry, right? We still have, well, actually, they have a lot of human-wildlife conflict right now, because they've been so successful that they have more rhinos and more tigers that are causing problems for people, right? So as soon as you can solve one problem, but there's always more. So just to put, there's never an end to the things that we're trying to solve and the situations we're trying to make better. So to get into my own research a little bit, and the reason why I'm motivated, Nepal obviously motivated me. Having been there in the early 90s when it took off and seeing the results of that really motivated me. But then my own research was looking at local communities' values, like why do they participate? What do they get out of this? Because looking at the literature, you hear, oh, they're poor communities, we have to convince them that they want to conserve biodiversity, they're too poor to care, right? We have to give them benefits. And when I looked at people's conservation values, how they feel about different types of protected areas or community areas, I found that we really undervalue local conservation values and the extent to which they value their environment. And we also underestimate the diversity within a community of the different types of values, right? They're never homogeneous. It's probably like this group here. If we start asking, why do you like the park near you? You're all gonna have different reasons, right? And we're pretty homogeneous because you wouldn't be here unless you sort of had some interests in common, right? But in a community, they have a whole diversity of values. They don't have one mind about it, which makes it really interesting. So I've looked at people's attitudes in a bunch of different contexts in my research. Protected areas in different places in Asia, community sacred forests in Yunnan, China, non-protected forests in Myanmar. And then we've also looked at people's motivations to participate in community conservation projects like being forest guards or tiger rangers. And so just kind of to try and summarize, how do local communities feel about conservation? I'm going to talk about one particular review I did looking at people's attitudes towards protected areas. So protected areas should be the place where we see the most negative attitudes, because those are areas with fines and fences approach, right? Like a national park, you cannot legally extract, right? Under IUCN guidelines, in no country can you legally extract from a national park. Wildlife reserves are also tightly protected. So people should be the most negative because they don't have access anymore. These might have been places They are places where they might have parents buried or religious sites that they used to go to, and now it's closed off and they can't go to them anymore. So I reviewed a number of case studies that covered 132 protected areas, which are all those dots, and these were all studies that in some way, shape, or form asked local communities, how do you feel about the protected area, right? Do you like or dislike some version of that question? And the mean positive attitude percentage across all those protected areas was 73%. So on average, 73% of people around each of those protected areas said they liked it overall. The balance of their negative and positive feelings were positive. And in 84% of the areas, more than half the people like the protected area, right? So it's really impressive, right, how positive they really are. And you're like, why? These are areas they can't legally extract from, they can't access. So here's a list of perceptions and benefits, perceptions of benefits and problems that came up in those studies. And the key one to look at is 81%. In 81% of those protected areas, people were mentioning conservation of biodiversity and regulating services, like ecosystem services. And I'll describe what those are more. But that's 81%. The next highest is problems, limitations on extraction and use, which I mentioned, right? People are, we say, ambivalent, right? The attitude is always ambivalent. There's pros and cons to living near a protected area. So people appreciate that it conserves things, and they appreciate that they do get resource extraction. So this is really interesting. There's a lot we could talk about, but I'm gonna leave that. And then talk about, so looking across all the research I've done, the main thing I found is that what predicts people's positive attitudes, those, whether it's protected areas or their own forests, is if they perceive conservation and ecosystem service benefits. And conservation ecosystem service benefits, when you ask somebody what's positive, what do you like about the protected area, it's them saying things like, well, it conserves, the protected area conserves the forest and the wildlife, rhinos, elephants, whatever's in there. It protects natural heritage. It's our national heritage. It's protecting that. We get clean environment from the protected area, good rainfall, more water for our crops, fresh air, good climate, soil moisture, soil fertility, right? They see all these kinds of ecosystem services, and that's why they appreciate it. In some places, like when you look at Nepal, if there was not a protected area in some places, there would be no forests left, right? They know that. They know that without some of that protection, they wouldn't have anything. And then what predicts people seeing conservation and ecosystem service benefits? Having knowledge about conservation. So in the case of the protected areas, people who knew like when the area was protected, why it was protected, they're the ones who saw these types of benefits and then tended to be more positive. And so what we see then is in a lot of places we look at like gender differences and we say, oh, women aren't as positive, right? Well, because women, because they're more burdened with household responsibilities, they depend more on fuel wood from that forest, and so they suffer more because of that protected area. But if you actually go in and look at their perceptions, what we found, for example, in Myanmar, for just one example, is that women are less likely to like it, but it's because they do not see conservation and ecosystem service benefits to the same extent as men. And that's because they don't have access to that information, right? They often, especially now, there's pretty large numbers of kids going to school, but the generations that we're doing these interviews with, women tend to be less educated. They are not invited to meetings. They're not expected to participate necessarily, right? And a lot of the cultural places, a lot of the culture in the places we're working, women just don't get invited. They're supposed to be home doing stuff. They also may lack time. They do have more responsibilities often. They can't make it to meetings. And so it's mainly because they don't have access. They're not going to the meetings where the park staff is meeting with communities or the forest department is meeting with the community and explaining what is community forestry all about or what is the protected area all about. And we would expect similar patterns for other marginalized groups like women. So people who are poor or more dependent on certain livelihoods like fishing, more dependent directly on the environment. So things are, these differences are not caused by gender or poverty per se, it's access to information. So in a lot of our projects, that's a key variable, is people don't always have access to information about the context of their biodiversity, right? Like if they have elephants every day in their field, they honestly don't know that we don't have elephants in the US necessarily. Right? Some people just don't, they're like, well, you don't have, what do you mean you don't have elephants? They're so common here, or whatever species, right? They're used to it. It's an everyday thing for them. And for them to understand sort of that context, it's actually, we had it happen out here in Mezomanie. We had a remnant prairie bluff, and half the community didn't know what was protected there and why it was important this year, and they wanted to build trails in it, right? And we have endangered species up there. And once they sort of had the information, they're like, oh, it makes sense, right, that this is an area that should be protected. So information is really critical. And I also want to point out that the difference with women is actually a lot like Europe and the USA. We find the same thing here when we do wildlife surveys, is that the men tend to be the one, if a survey comes to the house, for example, the men are the ones who tend to answer it. It's just sort of, men are the ones who do more environmental stuff. They do more hunting, more wildlife. So there's also research that shows that some of those differences are here. And I just like to point this out because we're often, again, it's like the glass half full, half empty. We can talk about all the differences, but we have a lot in common too with all these communities. So community conservation is powerful because, it works because it builds on positive and diverse values that communities already have. We're not teaching them about these values. We're not convincing them of anything. They want to conserve their biodiversity. So now I'm going to take you through some projects where community conservation is working now. And I've visited all these sites within the last couple of years or so. So first we're going to go to Peru. And in Peru, in most of the countries, in all the countries, we work with local partners, national or local NGOs, and support them to work with the communities. And so in Peru, it's the Neotropical Primate Conservation Group. And our founder, Rob, went there in 2009 and 2011 and worked with them because they sort of had a similar approach to him, and he had the idea that for them to really gear their work up, they should have these workshops. So Rob found that if you bring a lot of stakeholders together in an area and have workshops with like local government people, NGOs, community leaders, and say, hey, we're here in this area, your district or the state of Peru, and we would love to help you conserve biodiversity, that communities will come to you. You don't need to go convince anyone, they'll ask for help. And so since then, and Sam, this is Sam, the founder here, he said that they're still getting kind of phone calls based on the networking that came out of those workshops. So since then, they've created 11 locally run protected areas, which in Peru are called conservation concessions. And they're working on 4 new ones right now. I'm going to show you some of those. They protect almost 500,000 hectares of forest and 16 primate species, amongst, of course, a bunch of other species, but they focus on primates. And I just want to give a shout out to Sam. I love their logo is Primates Protecting Primates, and he's just about the best dad of 2 little kids you can imagine. So he's a really good primate. So the first site I want to take you to is Yantalo, which is, there's a group of 16 farmers who want to protect the hillside, that mountain up there where there's still good forest, because there's outsiders coming in who are cutting it down and trying to have fields there and crops. And the 16 farmers depend on this forested area for water for their own crops, right? And for all the wildlife that's in there. They don't want to see it get destroyed, because right now it's just sort of open land and no one actually has tenure over it. So they want to create a community conservation concession. And what's interesting in Peru is that these groups can't, the area protects the critically endangered San Martin titi monkey. Here's a baby that, my son sometimes goes along as the photographer, so then I have good video. If he's not there, I'm in trouble. But so in Peru, they need lots of help to put together the paperwork that they have to do to get a concession. No community could really do all the paperwork by themselves. They also cannot extract anything to make money. So they need a sustainable financial management plan to register the area, but all they could do is tourism. And most places can't support tourists or make money that way. So they really rely on the NGOs to help them do the surveys, do socioeconomic survey, biodiversity survey, management plan, and financial plan, and long-term support, right? So this is part of that polycentric governance I mentioned, where people sort of have to be working together. The communities can't do it alone. And this is one of the farmers here, and he allows the students, NPC has volunteers and students who come to help carry out the studies that they need to get registered. And he lets them cook in his kitchen and stay there, and he's very supportive of the whole idea. And here's a couple more just species that we saw, the endemic Andean saddleback tamarin. And then looking for the San Martin titi monkey, we came across a bicolored spined porcupine, which is of least concern in terms of conservation, but is very, very cute. So the next site that we visited was the Delta. And this is interesting because it was a site that NPC actually helped create 10 years ago. And this is there's a forested area at the top, the farmers are down below, and there's an urban city that relies on those forests kind of spread around this valley for their water. And as outsiders come in and cut and burn, they want to protect it. So this actual site was started 10 years ago by NPC and is running into problems because of the paperwork. So every 5 or 10 years, they have to re-up everything, re-register, sort of do updates. And in this case, the management of the community changed for this concession. So they have to like re-register from scratch because they hadn't kept up with it. So without NPC to help them do that, they really have no way of working their way through all that paperwork. But when we went out with Nestor here, who's the director of NPC now. And Nestor was really excited. These are some of the farmers. He was very excited because they said, and it's not just us that wants to re-register, we have 2 other groups that want to create concessions, which means they can go out to one area and sort of do 3 protected areas all at once. And this is what our founder, Rob Horwich, and Sam, actually, they've written a paper, they call conservation contagion. So if you get one community going, you get them doing a project like this, surrounding communities get interested. They also want to do it. There's benefits from doing it, right? They have power over the land. They get to make decisions and protect it. And so it's a very powerful model to work with one community because it can spread and scale up. So now we're going to move over to Cameroon in Africa. And our partner here is Community-Based Biosynergy Management. The founder is Dennis Ndelo down here. He started working with Rob quite a few years ago in Cameroon, but he just founded this NGO a couple of years ago since Rob has died, and this is his staff down below. And he did a similar thing. So 2 years ago or a year and a half ago when I first went with him to Cameroon and he was beginning the projects, these new projects with his NGO, he had a national level meeting in Yaoundé, the capital, where he invited NGOs, government people, local leaders, kind of like I described in Peru, to say, hey, we're here. And one of the points of what he wanted to do was talk about community forestry. So Cameroon has a community forestry model, sort of similar to Nepal's, but it only happens in the southeast part of the country, really. The government only registers forests down there, and it's all about high-value hardwood timber. Right? So it's focused on money, and Dennis really wanted to start off his work there by opening up that dialogue because people were talking about it needs to be more about than just communities making money, right? There's other benefits, and the communities are not really getting allowed to express the other values that they have towards their community forests. So that was a great meeting, and out of that, and this is just to remind, when I travel, I love giving the example of Nepal to everybody, right? Because it can be powerful at a national level, right? So having that model is amazing. So this is the first site I want to show. This is a community leader in the white outfit, and that's Dennis next to him. And he had asked us to come visit because he said, we're not in an area where there are community forests. This is up in kind of the Savannah area in the northwest central area. And they've got chimps, which there's fewer and fewer chimps all the time, and the forest is getting really degraded, a lot of it by outsiders coming over the border from Nigeria who they can't protect the forest because they have no actual tenure, legal tenure over it in terms of like a community forestry. So they've asked, can you help us make it a community forest? Can you help us get it registered, convince the local government that that's the way to go, and help us with the chimps? And this was a population of chimps that no one knew was there. Right, this is a remnant population, or maybe it's hooked into like some corridors to the larger population in the country. But this is one thing Dennis was really interested in figuring out but things like, even if it's remnant, if this community wants to protect it, we need to go in and help them, right? So he's in the process now, sort of figuring out how many chimps there are, who they're connected to, what's happening with the forest. So these are chimp nests we found when we were there, and since then they have actually camera-trapped chimps. These are Nigerians. So Nigerians come over these really small trails through the forest. They bring oil from Nigeria and they take back foodstuffs because they're short of like oil and rice and food in Nigeria. And as they do that, some of them they bring over their cattle, they burn the fields, they burn the forest to make fodder for their cattle. So right now, Dennis is working trying to figure out, well, what can we do to stop this? And registering it as a community forest is going to be a long, slow process probably. But they're trying. So here's the having a community meeting in the chief's tribal, not really palace, but they sort of have some term that refers to it in that way, traditional leader place. And then they worship, or part of their culture, the spider and snakes are really important. So most of our partners do education activities also, trying to get the next generation involved and interested. So this was a spider drawing competition with the kids. And then in the nearest big city, there's a new museum for this group of people, this tribe, which is a spider and then the snakes. So it's pretty amazing, brand new museum they just built. So the second site I want to go to is Baka Communities near the Jaw Faunal Reserve, which is down in the southeast. This is a community forest leader. This community forest has been around for 20 years or so. It's quite famous. There's research articles about it. And here, they've asked us to come because they said, yeah, so we have this community forest. That's awesome. But we thought, well, now it's ours. We can hunt like we have always hunted, right? We can just do it in our traditional manner. And then they realized, well, wait, no, because it's not sustainable, right? This forest is much smaller, and here they're sort of drawing out sort of where they traditionally use the forest and then where their community forest is. And they're like, we need help figuring out how to sustainably hunt. We do need to change our traditional methods. This isn't going to work over the long term. Here's some of the timber that's getting taken out, which is also destroying. They rely on 14 species of bees as part of their culture, and the bees are getting destroyed because of all the logging that's going on. Here's a pastor who's worked with this community for 20 years, and he's trying to figure out how to get the bees to go into hives so that they can conserve the bee population, since it's so critical to the Baka's tradition and culture. And so in terms of the wildlife conservation and sustainability, what Dennis is trying to do is he's working right now, he's got 10 communities who have volunteered, 2 people in each community have volunteered to learn how to do wildlife monitoring using software that you can put on smartphones. And then they can mark whatever they see. If they see a poacher, a hunter, timber cutting, wildlife, footprints, whatever they see, they can start to monitor. And so that's a program he's just getting going with them, and then helping so they can make decisions. Right? Like, we don't know what the outcome's going to be. They've asked for help figuring out how to do it sustainably, and so it's all a process, right? Well, let's start monitoring and see what there is, and then figure out how much there is, and then figure out what so there's a lot of questions that will have to be answered. Okay, now we're moving on to Nepal. So in Nepal, I've worked there since 1991 when I went in Peace Corps, but community conservation officially came, and Rob came with me back in 2012. So this is the first, we did a tiger monitoring training in Chitwan National Park in 2012. And I just want to highlight here, we have people from Assam, because Rob had worked for a long time in Assam on the Golden Langur Conservation Project, which is one of our more famous, well-known projects. Again, if you looked it up, that along with in Belize, the Community Baboon Sanctuary was the very first one, also a very famous project. And Rob had this vision that why can't we have a corridor from Chitwan, which is in the middle of Nepal, all the way over to India and Assam and Manas. So I'm going to show you a map of that. So he had asked people from Assam to come to this training, and I just visited them last month for the first time and actually got to see the Assam site, because we are trying to bring to fruition Rob's vision of this corridor over the last few years. And then just the New York Times has a great article also about Nepal growing back its forests, just as an example. So here are the maps that show you, so Manas is over here on this top right-hand map, and then this is Chitwan. And so we're trying to create a community conservation, community wildlife corridor stretching from here all the way over to the border, and then hopefully over into Assam someday. So we've been working down in this area now. We just finished a couple of years working in Japa and Morong in the southeast, doing camera trapping. And as part of that, we did the camera trapping because community forestry is wildly successful in Nepal, but people still think wildlife should be in national parks and wildlife sanctuaries, right? There's no integration of wildlife into community forestry. And so that's, again, one of the next steps that has to happen. And communities are very interested, so we camera trap just so they could see what was in their community forests. So this is some of this is the best video we got was a pangolin, a Chinese pangolin with a baby on its tail. So that was very exciting to get that. And then for each of the community forests that we camera trapped in, and we can only do about 14 in each district, and there's maybe 100 community forests in each district, right? So there's a lot of people involved. But we put together videos like this, so for each community forest, they could see what sort of wildlife they had. And then as we were doing this process with them, one thing that they were telling us was, well, the biggest threat to our management of wildlife is our poachers, local poachers who are killing things like deer just to sell locally. And the police are helping them, right? Like, we report them, the police might come arrest them, but they let them out the next day because it's a corrupt system. And so the communities say we can't stop the poaching. We can't really control outsiders from, keep them from coming in. And so as part of that dialogue and, after showing them the videos and having this conversation, there's a model within buffer zones in Nepal where there are community-based anti-poaching units. So communities have come together in the buffer zones around Chitwan National Park and Bardia National Park and created their own anti-poaching units. They go out and patrol for poachers, and when they find them, they call like the Army and the local forest guards, and the Army is the one who protects national parks. And so we said to the communities we're working with, okay, there's no protected area near you, but you could create similar groups, right? You could use the same model and then maybe try and get more attention to the issues that you're having with poachers, because we can't really tell police not to be involved, right? It's very sensitive, the communities can't really do it. So looking for ways to sort of help, affect change. Here we are showing one of the communities, their video. Now you notice women here. Some of the pictures didn't have too many women in them, like in Peru. Gender is an interesting aspect which I can talk a lot more about, and I haven't mentioned too much yet. Then we're going to move on to Myanmar. So in Myanmar, I've worked there since 1999 with a group called Friends of Wildlife, and then CC started working with them about a handful of years ago. And the model in Myanmar is very different. There's community forestry, but it's kind of new and there's very little support. The government doesn't like to register community forests. So our partner, Friends of Wildlife, has been trying to register a community forest in Chatin Wildlife Sanctuary, where we've been working with them since '99 for like 10 or 15 years now. And the government just refuses to, they always have some excuse of why it can't get registered. But so in order to circumvent some of that, so this partner has done a lot of the management plan preparation for a bunch of protected areas, and in doing so they did socioeconomic surveys. So based on work that we had done with them back in '99 in Chatin to make sure communities are included in protected area management plans, and based on that they knew local leaders who were interested in conservation in all of these protected areas. And so they started having, I don't have the right picture. They started having, trainings of these leaders at Indaji Lake, which is a biosphere reserve where they've built a training center. So they've trained a bunch of what they call biodiversity heroes in how to do community-based projects, how to do whatever they think is important, whether it's like some places it's litter and plastic, right, because the impacts on wildlife, or cleaning up waterways. And so they've done trainings with people from 15 different protected areas, and then 7 protected areas have ongoing projects that the local communities have started. Of course, things have slowed down there with the political conflict over the past couple of years. They really can't get out and do trainings or work with communities. They have successfully gone up to the Naga area in northwest Myanmar, and at the request of the communities, they're like, please come and help us. We've got a couple of wetland areas that we really want to conserve, and we really want your training. So they have been able to get up there and do that, which is great. And then we're going to end with Malaysia in Borneo, Sarawak. And this is the traditional roads in Sarawak, is on a boat going up a river, but new roads are getting built all the time between timber roads and the forest department helping to try and increase tourism in the communities. The car roads are coming quickly. And this is an interesting project where it was a Smithsonian project, and there was a student here in the Nelson Institute who was working with Smithsonian to camera trap in a protected area near these 2 longhouses that we work with now. And she was hiring the men in the longhouse to sort of be the daily laborers that would go out and help with the camera trapping, right? Carry the cameras, replace, take out the memory cards and do all that kind of work. And then at some point a couple of years ago, she's like, well, I'm done with getting my master's. I've kind of extracted what I need for my project, but I really want to work with these communities. The communities we're talking about, the orangutans are not coming as close to the village. The hornbills are decreasing. They have a lot of rubber. They've been planting a lot of rubber, which means they don't have as many useful fruit trees around their villages. And so there was, they wanted to do something conservation oriented. So Olivia asked me to come, and she also wanted to try and get women involved. And so we're trying to convert this project from sort of like paying people to help with camera trapping to them designing what they want to do to help with conservation in their own area, what to do with these rubber. We're standing in a rubber plantation here. And in terms of women, she said, well, I've always been hesitant to ask the women because they're so busy. They've got so many responsibilities. I don't want to add to that. So she'd never even asked them or talked to them about if they were interested. And I said, well, you have to ask. So having worked, Nepal has amazing policies to include women. They have a long way to go, but at every meeting and every type of group, there's supposed to be 30 to 50% women. So it's just expected that you will invite women, you will ask them, you will try and get them to participate. So I said, we just have to ask them. I mean, that's all you can do, right? And we asked them, and they said, yeah, why didn't you ask us 2 years ago? We would have loved to have been involved, right? We do want to learn. So we did an impromptu day day-and-a-half training with the women. So here's a group of women learning how to do camera trapping with Olivia. Here they are putting up a camera. And they had a great time. And this gets talked a lot. If you involve women, you are more likely to involve the kids. So I don't have a picture here, and most of the kids in these longhouses are going to school in cities. So they're really missing out. This is going to be a huge issue in these communities, right? Who's going to, these longhouses are probably going to disappear because the kids are all getting educated in the city and they'll stay there. But the ones who were home this day, this was like a weekend, a holiday weekend, they were coming around with us and learning it and posting, taking videos and photos. And probably when they got back to the city, they were posting on Facebook, right? The activities that they'd done in their village. So just to kind of wrap up, so currently CC is directly supporting communities, and that's what I've mainly talked about here today. But over the past couple of years, I've also tried to create a partner network. I talked about our founder sort of would go from project to project, sort of working on it, and then when it was sustainable, moving on to a new one. But I'm trying to bring together a lot of those partners that we've been working with over the years into a network. So we have monthly Zoom meetings where we share lessons and experiences. We share a lot of information about technical stuff like camera trapping in communities, and now we're trying to figure out how to sort of get all that information from camera traps back to communities, and so we're sharing a lot of information that way. Sharing about different policies and the impacts, right? Like in Peru, they can't extract, and that just seems crazy to those of us who work in areas where communities are able to extract fuel wood or grass or sort of everyday things that they need. And we're also offering online courses and workshops, both for our partners and their staff, and then other people who are interested, globally, they can hook into those. Because I've seen there's so many younger people for many years now, people when they're studying or studying ecology or biology and working out in the field, they're like, I want to include communities. I know I should be including them, but how do I do it, right? So we're really trying to broaden the network of people who work with communities and aren't afraid. I think sometimes people are afraid. They do feel like I can't talk to the community because I'm just here to get my research, I'm here to achieve this goal, right? And I don't know what to do. So we're really trying to get people to think first about communities. And then I just want to briefly say, what can you do? Well, you can learn more at our website. We have a lot of information up there. I've also put sign-up sheets in the back, and you can go online and sign up for our newsletter and email updates. And you can donate. We're really relying. The other problem with some of the ways that Rob would do work is that he relied on grants, in addition to donors, right? But grants, if you don't get it, it means you have to stop the work with communities. And that's not a very good way to work with communities. So in Nepal, we actually had to drop the program for a few years because we couldn't get funding. And I'm trying to avoid that. And I'm like, okay, we need to get sustainable with individual donors so that we don't, just because we don't get a grant, we don't have to say, sorry, we'll try again. That's just not a good way to work. You can follow us on social media and please, share our work with friends that you think might be interested. And I mean, Tom's point about, the lessons here, I think if you, like my example of mesomany, right? So many of these community processes for conservation are the same here as in so many other countries, but we have a lot more opportunity, right? That list of groups that just Rob had worked on. How many conservation groups are in Wisconsin, right? How much work do we have where we can volunteer and participate? But a lot of these communities, they don't have that support. They don't have NGOs or groups or governments that is supporting them to access the knowledge, to have the capacity to conserve biodiversity, So when you're helping them, you're helping people just like us here in this room, right? Have the opportunities that we have in our own communities. And that's the end, and I would love to take questions.
Questions?
Yeah, thanks. Okay, great. Why is there so much resistance from governments to register these community forest projects locally?
I feel weird because I can't see where the question came from. Oh, sorry, right over here. Sorry, it's right with you. Okay. Why is there resistance from the government? Because it's power. So even in Nepal in the 70s and 80s, it didn't take off to the 90s, even though the legislation was passed in the 80s, because the Forest Department and the government had to be convinced that communities could play a role and you could trust them. And so it took a lot of donor pressure, it took a lot of experience. Again, sort of that polycentric governance. No government is going to give up power, right? And timber forests, there's so much valuable money in those that people don't want to turn it over to community. I mean, community conservation is probably the most radical thing in the world, I like to say, right? Because it's communities making decisions about their own natural resources, not the timber companies, not the mining companies, like with fracking in Wisconsin, right? Yeah.
So for the national parks in the U.S., do you think they should be managed differently in regards to extraction of resources?
In terms of the extraction of,
Lumber or
meaning
mining
should there be extraction
or
from national parks?
animals or...
I happen to think national parks, if you look at the research, I mean, so there's arguments to say that there should be more co-management of national parks, right? There should be more involvement of stakeholders, like Native Americans, Indian tribes around national parks in the US, right? But I think most people agree that national parks, they play a role in most countries. So a country like Nepal, they play a really important role in conserving a lot more biodiversity in different ways than you might see in a community conserved area. So it's kind of like we need a mosaic of different types of conservation going on with different priorities. I mean, the density of rhinos and tigers in national parks in Nepal is amazing, but the whole landscape can't support that kind of density, right? So there's a role for the national parks, but there's a role for communities to also be making. So basically, you want well-preserved areas, but you also want to have more people participating in the decision-making, I think, over those areas. But you don't want things being taken out of it. Like, I don't want anyone going into Chitwan National Park and starting to take out lumber or something, right? The tigers and rhinos aren't going to do very well.
So where does the data go from all these different systems or different efforts that your team makes? Is there any, like WWF or some other group that could gather all that data? I just saw the Google car drove around town yesterday. So,
do you in terms of like the camera trapping?
Yeah, all the work that you do, all that data. I mean, where does all that go?
And that's one of the questions as a network we're starting to talk about, because all these projects do have all this data. And for example, the partner in Nepal that's helping us, he is also a quantitative ecologist. So he really wants to take the data and publish it. So a lot of people do camera trapping so they can publish data. We're not doing it for that reason, right? And there are sort of open repositories where you can put data, but it's hard to get people to do it because they want to publish and use the data themselves. So there are places, and that's what we're looking into now, is as a network, what are our recommendations? Which of these databases do we want to be putting our data into? How can it get used? How can we make sure the community is actually the one making the choice also, right? It's their data, it's their camera photos, their wildlife. Where do they want it going up? So interestingly, I'm all excited about iNaturalists now, because when we've been going to communities, there's usually people who are really interested in their wildlife and have a smartphone, and I say, hey, have you seen iNaturalist? So, and they're very excited about it. So I'm also hoping that it will turn away from us camera trapping, which is extremely cumbersome, right? Camera traps are hard to haul around. It costs a lot to get someone to put them up and take them down, and then you have all this data that you don't want to go to waste. I would love to get the communities, again, doing their own monitoring, and through an open access software like iNaturalist would be great, right? Because we would avoid a lot of the problems that we're facing. They also get poachers in their camera traps, right? And so when they catch poachers, that's a whole nother issue in terms of how the community is going to use camera traps. It gets really sticky really fast. So I would love to see us move away from camera trapping, actually, and find other ways for monitoring and appreciating the wildlife that the communities have.
How do working with communities that are urban and cities on conservation and biodiversity contrast to rural or wilder areas?
Yeah, so we don't work too directly in urban areas, although in Nepal, some of these community forests are right next to cities and urban areas, right? So in terms of awareness and education, it has to happen in the cities too. They're the ones buying like the deer meat, right, from the poachers in the community forests right next door to the urban areas. So, I mean, in most of the places we don't have quite that dense a population right nearby. But a lot of that is just awareness raising of those communities too, right? And them appreciating and using these areas. So another problem in Nepal is the urban areas are using the community forest to dump trash. They don't really have landfills, they don't have waste management disposal. So that is a huge issue, and we have to integrate across those. And I think it's a little different from place to place, what the role of the urban areas are and what our approach should be.
Other questions? There's one online.
All right. This is from Raj on Zoom. Do you coordinate with World Wildlife Federation and so that community-based biodiversity can thrive with the support of WWF?
Well, WWF is a huge organization, and in some places we do collaborate with them. So actually in Myanmar, because no one can officially be putting money in, we can only sort of technically support groups there. WWF is also supporting our partner there because they really like this Naga project that I mentioned. So in the right times and circumstances, yes. And it's interesting, a group as big as WWF, they have great examples where they've really supported community conservation, like in Namibia, which has community wildlife conservancies, which are amazing. Like the government put those policies into place and WWF has supported it. And then you have other countries like Nepal, I would say, where WWF has been more like on that livelihood end of things, where they're like, we want to improve people's income, and they don't necessarily directly support communities. So it'd be great to get all those organizations. That would be, a long-term dream, is to get all those, what we call the bingos, the big environmental NGOs, moving towards thinking about community conservation like we do, right? Where you're really building and they're sort of inconsistent. It depends on the country and the policies. And some of you may have seen some of the articles in BuzzFeed or Cultural Survival about WWF and its support of the Army and other contentious human rights issues. So I think it would help them a lot if they move more towards this approach, really thinking about communities and their role in doing the biodiversity conservation.
Thanks. Yeah, I was curious, what are the reasons why a country like Cameroon is unable to keep out persons coming in from Nigeria to exploit resources illegally? And then I have a similar question in the case of Myanmar. Is the problem there because of the military ruling junta is so corrupt and development focused? Thanks.
So let's see. So in terms of Cameroon, the problem is a long, porous border, right? And there's no one there. There's just those little trails all across the border area there. And so one thing that they were explaining with if they could get community forestry and then they would have like legal tenure, they may be able to get local support more from the police, right? Because it'd be a recognized sort of area that they're protecting. That's the hope, right? But the police cannot possibly patrol that whole border. In the case of Myanmar, yes, obviously, all the problems with what's happening in Myanmar, a lot of it is caused by it's caused by what's going, the total lack of being able to move forward, like for our partner, is because of what's happening there now with the conflict. But in terms of the community level, yeah, no one ever, whether it was the last 2 years or the last 20 years, they just don't want to turn power over to communities to protect natural resources, right? They're just not convinced. And so that's a problem, whether it's the military or it's a democratically elected government, right? That's just a huge mind shift that, even in Nepal, you'll have lots of people, sure, everyone gives lip service to communities, but that doesn't mean everyone truly believes that you can trust them, right? So yeah, it's always a difficult thing.
Well, I suppose in Myanmar there would be a problem because of all the secessionist state armies that are still active there.
Yeah, and so in terms of our partner specifically, right, trying to get to sites, they couldn't move into the Naga area until they knew there weren't bombs on the road. And each checkpoint, they're sort of like, is this our, like the Myanmar government checkpoint, or is this like the resistance force checkpoint? And so they don't really care who it is as long as they know that people have been moving safely across the landscape to get there. So that's just kind of an interesting on the ground, the reality. It's not like they can't move at all and they can't do things, but because they're all living, right? They're all living under these conditions and somehow getting, doing things. It's just slow, and they're waiting to make sure, yeah, nobody was blown up, nobody's been shot there. It seems like a pretty safe area. Let's go do the training this week. That seems to be how they've been handling things.
We have another question on Zoom.
Okay.
You mentioned gender differences in the perception of benefit in community conservation. Was there an examination of generational/age differences? Possibly older persons who appreciate the recovery of their environment more because they've witnessed the before/after. Possible allies to provide positive anecdotal support for future efforts elsewhere.
Yeah, so I think age, that is true about age, right? Older people have seen the changes, and either they see the degradation and they want it to get better, or in the case of Nepal, they knew what it was like 30 years ago before they started protecting it. So obviously age, it's like me being able to look back over the 90s, and I can see how amazing Nepal has done, but the young conservationists look at me and they're like, what the heck are you talking about? There's so many problems. Why are you so positive about this? So yeah, age makes a huge difference in the perceptions. So one study that we did in the Yunnan sacred forests, we did look at age, because those are community sacred forests. And again, all the kids are going and being educated elsewhere, kind of like in Malaysia. And there is a feeling that all that knowledge is going to be lost. All that sacred forest, those are traditional sacred forests that have been protected despite the Cultural Revolution, right? Despite all these terrible points in history, and they still have the stories about their forests. They still are protecting them and not doing too much cutting, not too much damage. And so we sort of tested the hypothesis that the young people don't care. And what it seemed like is the young people had the same values, the same understanding. They just don't know all the stories yet, right? They don't know all the history yet because they're 20 and they're going to school or they're working. And who at 20 knows all the stories of their own towns or villages or their own family history to some extent, right? And so what we got out of it was that their values seem to be the same. They're just younger and not as interested in some of those details yet. But you know, they'll learn them. At some point, they'll want to ask, right? When their parents are getting older, what's happening? And they're also probably going to want to move back, I think. People, you know, if there's opportunities, they will move back and not just want to be in cities their whole lives, which will be really important too. Was there a gender piece to that, or just the age? I got off on the age.
Yeah, just the age.
Okay.
I have great admiration for what you're doing. I think that's a very good approach to conservation worldwide. But I also have a kind of off-topic question. Where is that photograph?
And that is where we began when Tom walked into the room, and we were talking, it looks like Glacier National Park, and it's Peru.
No, it doesn't look.
It's in northern Peru, just sort of on the edge of the Amazon area, kind of, it's near, yeah.
She says, no, it doesn't look like Glacier.
You don't think it does, a little bit?
She
Oh,
thought
okay.
it
Yeah, that's Peru. That's
There aren't
Peru.
any glaciers in Glacier either. So.
Yeah, that's what Glacier, that's what it's going to look like in another 10, 20 years.
I have a question about measures of effectiveness. I could see how, I mean, one of the things that's easier to quantify in terms of effectiveness is forest cover. But I was wondering if you have any beyond sort of like, okay, getting land tenure secured, what other mechanisms do you have to monitor? Well, you know, is there still livestock allowed in? Does it vary from place to place? How are you measuring and evaluating whether this is working from a conservation perspective in addition to forest
Yeah.
cover?
So in most of the project sites, there was a particular species that people were interested in. So like the howler monkey, there's the howler monkey, and the golden langur project, there's the golden langur. So most of them, there's some key species historically in our projects, and you measure them, and they're increasing, right? My own personal philosophy after working in Nepal for so long, and for me, it's a process, right? And it's more about the process of working with communities and leaving something behind so they can make those decisions and those choices. So yeah, we can go in and spend a lot of money on monitoring and publishing and sort of, but what is actually helpful to them to monitor? Do they want to know there's more golden langur? And in some cases, they probably say yes, and it's pretty easy to teach them how to monitor. But what are their key species? What do they want to measure? And so for me, at this point, it's more about the process of really building their capacity and figuring out what are the species they want to follow and how could they do it. And so so yes, so in most cases, but we're measuring something. Something is getting measured.
Any other questions? Sarah?
I had a question sort of along those lines that follows up on that, and whether any of these communities can become self-sustaining in their conservation efforts.
And that is a great question because, you know, how do we define sustainability? How do we define self-sustaining? This is the issue that's plagued us. And as I visited the old project sites, this is one reason I wanted, I mean, they are self-sustaining because we've created institutions, community have they've kept those institutions going. They're still making decisions about their resources. So yes, they are self-sustaining, right? Or any of these community forests in Nepal, once they get going, none of them have like stopped, right? They keep going especially when there's the policies behind them to support them doing it that make it, somewhat doable. In some countries, it's not as clear the policies are helping communities. But when I go back and visit the projects, so the one in Belize was private landowners, which is pretty unusual. Like I said, most places have some sort of policies for communities. In Belize, it was private landowners. I went back and visited them last year, and it's just a constant struggle. In 2000, the male landowners had sort of lost interest. There wasn't enough money from tourism, whatever. They sort of fell apart. And then the women took over, and they said, well, we're not going to let this stop. And they created a women's board that now runs the whole thing and has kept it going the last 23 years. And they struggle. It's a constant struggle. They're still looking for funding. There's not enough tourism. They can't get the higher end, whatever, everything's a process. It never ends, right? There's sort of, like I said, there's good things and then there's bad things that they're trying to deal with. I just got back from Assam, and in Assam, amazing success story. They have two different areas. One is around Manas Biosphere Reserve. They created these volunteer protection forces, which did an amazing job. The communities had their own volunteers. They were keeping out the timber cutters, because it's an area of conflict and an ethnic group and really complicated situation, but these volunteers did it. But, and this was starting 14, 15 years ago, now the government, sort of sounds like a dream come true. The government has decided to hire them all and just make them government staff, forest staff. So on one hand, that's awesome. They're being recognized. They're getting a salary. They're becoming a part of the system. On the other hand, now there's no community representation, right? So it was very controversial. When I was there, actually, it took me a long time. I was only there for 4 days, but it took me all 4 days to sort of pull out what was happening. I kept getting funny stories about, well, the heads of the volunteers have been cut off. The leaders are not working anymore. And I'm like, why aren't they working? Well, because they've been hired by the government. So now they're doing what the government is telling them to do. And then in another area that's not near Manas, it's down more near the urban area, actually, there's a whole bunch of communities that are protecting forest where the golden langur monkey lives. So it's community land, but with all these farmers and communities around it. And they're facing a problem of they did such a great job protecting it that government wants to turn it into a sanctuary, which means they have power over it. And the researchers, the scientists who so far have been all supportive of the communities doing the work, now they're like, oh yeah, it should be a sanctuary. And what I was told is because they'll get more research money, right? If it's a sanctuary, they get more money to do their research, right? So they're actually happier. So again, the struggle, right? They've done such a great job, and sometimes success brings these kinds of problems. So right now they're battling legality of how do we stop the government? It's a totally non-transparent process. They cannot turn it into a sanctuary according to all these laws that India has, but they've got to figure out how to try and stop it. So, good question. What's sustainable, right?
Any other questions? If not, thank you very much.
Thank you.